Okay, so today we're diving into a faith that's been around for thousands of years, a faith that's all about nonviolence, like taking it to a whole other level.
It's true.
And it makes you wonder, right? What makes these beliefs so powerful that they've endured for so long?
It's a fascinating question, and to explore it, we're going to look at these two sources you've provided. Cosmology.pdf, which sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, a little bit out there.
And Jainism.pdf.
So let's unpack this. Jainism, where do we even begin?
Well, at its heart, Jainism is all about understanding the true nature of reality and the importance of living ethically. We've got these texts to guide us. They offer some really intriguing insights.
I have to admit, when I first saw the title Cosmology.pdf, I thought, okay, this is going to be a tough one. But then I started reading about their beliefs on time and existence, and
It's mind-bending, isn't it?
it really is. They believe their first prophet, or Tirthankara, as they're called, Rishabhadeva, lived millions of years ago. Millions.
That's a completely different way of thinking about the history of, well, everything.
Right. Like, forget everything you thought you knew about timelines and ancient civilizations. But this idea of these Tirthankaras, these enlightened beings, it's a pretty central concept in Jainism, right?
Absolutely. They believe that there have been 24 Tirthankaras throughout cosmic history, each one guiding humanity towards enlightenment. And their teachings form the foundation of Jain philosophy.
Okay, so we've got these Tirthankaras, this vast timescale. But what are the core principles, the fundamental beliefs that guide Jains today?
Jainism boils down to three core principles: ahimsa, anekantavada, and aparigraha. And we can think of these principles as interconnected pillars that support the entire structure of Jain belief.
Okay, so let's break those down. Ahimsa, I'm guessing that's the nonviolence thing, right?
Exactly. Ahimsa is the principle of nonviolence, but we're not just talking about physical harm here. It's about extending compassion to all living beings, no matter how small or insignificant they may seem.
And anekantavada. That one sounds a bit more complex.
It is, but it's also one of the most fascinating aspects of Jainism. Anekantavada is often translated as non-absolutism or multiplicity of viewpoints, but at its core, it's the recognition that truth is multifaceted. There's no one right answer, no single perspective that encompasses the entirety of reality.
Okay, so it's about keeping an open mind, being willing to see things from different angles.
Precisely. And finally, we have aparigraha, which emphasizes non-attachment, particularly to material possessions.
So it's about living simply, not being ruled by material desires.
Exactly. And these three principles, nonviolence, understanding multiple perspectives, and non-attachment, they work together to create a framework for ethical living in Jainism.
It's a pretty radical departure from how many of us live our lives today, wouldn't you say? But getting back to this idea of a Jain universe, Cosmology.pdf talks about the universe being made up of 6 eternal substances, and I have to admit, this is where it got really interesting for me.
Ah, yes, the 6 eternal substances. This is where we really dive into the metaphysical depths of Jain cosmology.
Because, let's be honest, when you think about the fundamental building blocks of the universe, you don't usually think about things like
Motion and rest.
Exactly. But that's precisely what Jainism does. Souls, matter, space, and time. Those seem fairly standard.
The usual suspects, you might say.
But then they throw in Dharma and Adharma, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but those seem more like concepts, not actual, physical substances.
Right, and that's what makes Jain cosmology so intriguing. They're not just talking about the what of the universe, but the how. They're saying that motion and rest, dharma and adharma, are as fundamental to existence as space and time.
So dharma in this context isn't about, fulfilling your destiny or anything like that.
Not quite. In Jainism, dharma represents the principle of motion, the cosmic energy that propels everything forward. It's the force that allows for change and transformation. And adharma, on the other hand, represents the principle of rest, stability, that which provides balance and structure to the universe.
So it's like they had this intuitive understanding of concepts that we're only now beginning to explore in modern physics, things like entropy and the conservation of energy.
It's pretty remarkable when you think about it. They were grappling with these fundamental questions about the nature of reality centuries ago, and their insights still resonate with us today.
Okay. I am officially blown away.
Yeah.
So we've got these 6 eternal substances, this intricate dance of motion and rest. But how does this understanding of the universe actually play out in the lives of Jains? What does it mean for them on a daily basis? So we've talked about this Jain universe, this incredible idea of 6 eternal substances. But how does that actually translate into, the ethics of Jainism? How do they put those beliefs into action?
Well, that's where the 5 main vows come in.
Okay, 5 main vows. Tell me more.
These vows are at the heart of how Jains try to live their lives, minimizing harm and striving for spiritual growth.
These vows, are they kind of like commandments or something? Like rules everyone has to follow?
Think of them more as guidelines, like a framework for making ethical choices.
Okay, so less about hard and fast rules, more about guiding principles.
Exactly. Now, for Jain monks and nuns, these vows are followed very strictly. But even for lay Jains, the ones not living in monastic communities, they're still a major part of daily life.
So these vows, they're all about minimizing harm.
That's a big part of it, especially when we look at the first vow, ahimsa, which is all about nonviolence.
Right, ahimsa, that's a big one in Jainism.
Huge. And it goes beyond just not physically hurting others. It's about recognizing the inherent worth of all living beings. Remember Jiva?
Jiva, the soul, right?
Exactly. Jains believe that every living creature, no matter how small, possesses a jiva, a soul that goes through endless cycles of birth, death, and rebirth.
Wow, so even harming something as small as an insect is seen as creating negative karma.
That's the idea. In Jainism, your actions have consequences, not just in this life, but in future lifetimes as well.
That's pretty intense.
Yeah.
It makes you think twice about every little action, right?
It encourages mindfulness, a deep awareness of the impact of your choices.
Absolutely. But speaking of choices, we know Jains follow a lacto-vegetarian lifestyle. Is that all because of ahimsa?
That's a big part of it. They abstain from eating meat, fish, eggs, anything that involves taking the life of an animal.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about dairy? It seems like there's still some potential for harm there, right?
You're right. It's a topic of debate even within Jainism, but the general consensus revolves around minimizing harm. Dairy products are considered acceptable as long as they're obtained without causing suffering to the animal.
So it's like cruelty-free dairy, no factory farming or anything like that.
Exactly. It's about making conscious choices that align with the principle of ahimsa, even when it comes to things like what we consume.
I love how this connects to that idea of interdependence, how everything's connected, from the tiniest organism to the way we live our lives.
Exactly. It's a holistic approach to living ethically. But ahimsa is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right, there are 4 more vows, and we can't forget about those.
Exactly. We have satya, which emphasizes truthfulness, asteya, which is all about honesty and non-stealing, brahmacharya, which focuses on celibacy and chastity, and finally, aparigraha, which, as we've discussed, encourages non-attachment to material possessions.
Wow, it's like a whole ethical framework guiding Jains towards living a more mindful and compassionate life.
Precisely. These 5 vows provide a roadmap for spiritual growth, helping Jains move closer to that ultimate goal of liberation, of moksha.
And speaking of moksha, I'm curious to learn more about how that concept plays out in Jainism. It's not just about following these vows, right? What else is involved in this journey towards liberation?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. We need to dive into the different paths to moksha for ascetics and laypersons, explore those practices and rituals that guide Jains towards that ultimate state of spiritual freedom.
Okay, you've definitely piqued my curiosity. Before we get too deep into moksha, I want to circle back to this idea of anekantavada. We touched upon it briefly earlier, but I think it deserves a deeper dive, don't you?
Absolutely. It's such a fundamental concept in Jainism and one that has profound implications for how we understand the world and interact with each other. And that analogy you mentioned earlier, the one with the blind men and the elephant, it's a classic for a reason.
It really gets you thinking, right? Like, we all have our own limited perspectives, and it's so easy to get stuck in our own bubbles thinking we have all the answers.
It's a recipe for conflict and misunderstanding.
Exactly. But Anekantavada, it offers a way out of that trap, a way to approach disagreement with more humility and understanding.
Precisely. It's a call for empathy, a reminder that there's always more to learn, more to see beyond our own limited perspective.
It's such a powerful idea, and one that feels incredibly relevant in today's world.
Absolutely. In a world that often seems increasingly polarized, Anekantavada offers a path towards greater understanding and compassion.
So we've discussed ahimsa, the importance of nonviolence, Anekantavada, this idea of embracing multiple perspectives, and we've touched upon the 5 main vows that guide Jains towards ethical living, but there's still so much more to unpack, right? This idea of moksha, of liberation, of reaching a state of spiritual freedom. What does that actually look like in Jainism? So moksha, liberation. What does that actually look like in Jainism? What are we talking about here?
Well, in essence, moksha signifies the complete liberation of the soul, the jiva, from that endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth.
It's like reaching the ultimate destination, breaking free from that cycle.
Exactly. It's about attaining a state of perfect knowledge, bliss, pure freedom from all the suffering and limitations of the material world.
Okay, but how do you get there? Is it just about following those 5 vows we talked about? Is that all it takes?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. You see, in Jainism, the path to moksha can differ for ascetics and laypersons.
Okay, so different paths for different folks.
Right. Jain monks and nuns, those who choose a life of complete renunciation, they follow an incredibly strict path. They dedicate themselves to intense spiritual practices, meditation, study, complete non-attachment to worldly possessions.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly demanding, like next level dedication.
It is incredibly demanding. It requires immense discipline and willpower. And in some cases, it can even involve practices like salakana.
Salakana, okay, we're going to need to unpack that one. What is salakana?
A salakana is a ritual fast that's undertaken towards the end of life by some Jains who have reached a certain level of spiritual detachment. It's incredibly rare, but a deeply spiritual practice.
So it's a fast, but like a really, really serious fast.
Exactly. It's about gradually reducing food and water intake with the intention of purifying the soul and preparing for final liberation.
Wow, that is intense. It really shows the lengths to which some Jains are willing to go to achieve moksha.
But what about those who aren't monks or nuns? You mentioned lay persons have a different path.
Right, so for lay Jains, those living in the world, having families, jobs, and all that, the path to moksha is more about gradual progress. It's about living ethically, practicing ahimsa, cultivating detachment from material possessions, all those things we've been talking about.
So it's like a spiritual marathon, not a sprint. Precisely. It's about taking small steps, making ethical choices in your daily life, and slowly purifying your karma over many lifetimes.
It's interesting, isn't it? Even if you don't subscribe to Jain beliefs, these concepts of nonviolence, non-attachment, recognizing multiple perspectives, they resonate, don't they?
Absolutely. They offer a framework for living a more mindful and compassionate life, regardless of your background or beliefs.
And it just goes to show that exploring these ancient traditions, it's not just about, history or religion. It's about uncovering wisdom that's still relevant today, lessons we can all learn from.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note, a huge thank you to our expert for taking us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of Jainism.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive.